Check 1 2. Test test. Test 1 2. Mic test 1 2. Test 1 2. 1 2. Check 1 2. Testing 1 2. Mic 1 test. Mic 2 test. Mic 1 test. Mic 2 test.
Hello. Hey, everybody. Hi. It sounds good. Okay, great. Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending. You are here at the Case for Public Sector Open Data. My name is Sarah Ortiz-Shields, and I am the Interim Executive Director of Austin Tech Alliance. We are so excited to have you here. ATA is a homegrown Austin startup, and we focus on educating Austin's tech sector and getting them involved in civic action. The way that we do this is through events such as this one. We have a newsletter. We are a membership-based nonprofit, so if anybody is interested in joining us, I would encourage you to just come up and speak to me afterwards. I'm more than happy to talk to you about civics. Also, if anybody is here in Travis County and you need to register to vote, I will register you to vote, so please find me afterwards. We have a really exciting speaker list and panel for you. I hope everybody is really excited about data. I know that I am really excited to learn some things and ask some hard questions. So I would like to thank our sponsor, Tyler Technology, for providing us with food and drink. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank everybody, all of our panelists, the Data Coalition, Open Austin, and the City of Austin, along with all of our panelists for flying out and for attending and speaking. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Governor O'Malley and our Mayor Adler. So thank you everybody for being here. Let's get things kicked off with Christian.
Thanks everyone. I'm Christian Hayner, kind of coming from the federal perspective, but I work with the Data Coalition. We're a DC-based trade association and one of the partners here today. We represent kind of the emerging data industry. So think like your analytics, your platforms, your publishing, and companies that actually help the private sector comply with federal compliance. So we represent that perspective. Companies in the Austin area would include Grant Thornton, Booz Allen Hamilton, SAP, and Tableau. And I just want to reiterate our thanks to the City of Austin for not only hosting, helping partner with this today, but also the broader South by Southwest conference. I know this is a huge impact to the city, and they seem to be handling it really well. Also thanks to Sarah with Austin Tech Alliance and the Capital Factory, which I hope you get a chance to explore today. It's pretty cool. But a little bit more on kind of what we do here in DC. At the Data Coalition, we advocate for federal policy reforms to transform government information into open and standardized data. So the kind of theme here today is transparency outside, efficiency and management reforms inside government. So the panel will kind of get into that, and you'll hear from former governor and a current mayor about these, their approach to this. But open data has benefits for public accountability and transparency, as well as these internal government management reform initiatives, as well as oversight. And our federal advocacy focuses largely on two steps of open data. So the first is really passing laws and federal policies that mandate data standardization and governance processes in government. And then, once you've done that, you can move on to open publishing and public use, as well as external oversight. So that's really where we come from. And I just want to leave the audience with this. There's really no point to all this open data work if the organizations you represent and work with in your localities don't actually use this data. So I'd implore you to think about all the comments that are going to be thrown at you today, and how you can take these reforms and actually turn them into action and civil discourse. So thank you much.
Hello, my name is Mateo Clark. I'm a volunteer here on behalf of the leadership team of Open Austin. Open Austin's been around for about 10 years. So 10 years ago, the city was building a new website, and they weren't doing a great job. And the citizens of Austin organized, got together, and started to give their input about how this process should work. With that, the city was able to launch a website on an open source portal or platform called Drupal, and they were able to become an early adopter of a product called Sxsw, which is where the city has been publishing their open data for several years now. So what Open Austin does, aside from some of that advocacy work that I alluded to, is also making use of that open data. So we have monthly meetings, sometimes more frequently. We call them civic or community action nights, where we get folks together to teach them about open data, teach them about data science, teach them about web development, and also bring in the really important practices of design and project management, and try to get teams working together on projects they're interested in. So a couple projects I want to highlight that have been active recently or currently one is at the state level called Influence Texas. So we have a group of folks led by journalists and a DevOps developer who are really interested in the influence of money at the legislator up the road. And so they combined the state reporting data with votes, the votes that are actually happening on the floor of the legislator, to better understand how money is influencing specific votes and making that a lot more transparent. Another project I'd like to highlight, Rohan is here in the audience, I saw him earlier. He's been working with the City of Austin's Neighborhood and Housing and Community Development Department on a project to make data about affordable housing more available for the different agencies that are all working in that same space and kind of coordinating across their jurisdictions, but also the folks that need access to that affordable housing. So if you're interested in that project, definitely talk to Rohan. He's done a really great job of, one, kind of developing it outside with the support of Code for America, which is kind of the umbrella organization for Open Austin and other civic tech brigades across the country, but then also providing kind of a clean handoff to the city's Communications and Technology Management Department, and making sure that that project can be adopted and sustained within the city. So that's kind of an overview of what we do. We would love if you're interested in honing your skills or providing some mentorship to folks that are wanting to become designers and developers in our community and have a passion for civic works. We would love to see you at our next event. It's April Fool's Day. I think that's Monday, April 1st. So look forward to seeing you then.
Hold it close to your mouth.
Close.
Yeah, you have to hold it close.
Okay, so I was not in the proper stage in the area. So my name is Steve Murby. Closer? Is that good? Okay. I'm Steve Murby, and I'm the account executive with Tyler Technologies, formerly known as Sxsw. It's been mentioned by a few people up here. So for the last decade, we've been fortunate enough to work with some of the early adopters and innovators with open data, City of Austin being one of those. And so, through that work, we've actually been able to deliver or bring over 1,000 governments open data transparency to the cloud. Along the way, we've been fortunate enough to support legislation for open data and to assure open government. So thank you for ATA for having us here. City of Austin for being a long-term partner, and for those in the audience, thank you for having an interest in public sector open data. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Is this better if you just speak very loudly into the microphone? Okay. So I would like to introduce the Mayor of Austin, Mayor Steve Adler. Speak very closely.
Well, for those of you new in town, let me say welcome to Austin. How many people here are not from Austin? Okay, make sure that while you're here, you have to find some of the music. You are, after all, in the live music capital of the world. You have to make sure that you find some of our food trucks, eat some breakfast tacos. We have the best breakfast tacos in the world. Don't listen to San Antonio, they lie. This is just a great week for this city, and there's a lot of what is this city, both culturally and attitudinally, in this South by Southwest week. We're a creative, entrepreneurial, progressive city, and I think it finds its expression in what happens in and around South by. One of the things that we're real proud of in this city is the open data portal that we have in this city. We're one of the national and international leaders because we've been pushed by our community as well as a very talented staff to really move forward in that. And we do that for several reasons. One is the transparency associated with opening up government. It builds trust in government. You know, one of the reasons I think that when we did our last municipal bonds in November as part of the election, one of the reasons that those all passed at 70, 75, and 80% approval by taxpayers who are imposing tax burdens on themselves is that the community trusts government with spending that money. And when you're building that kind of trust, it's not only about having construction projects that come in on time, it's about having a government that is forward-looking, that has a general feel for being transparent. And I think that we have that in Austin, and it's one of the cultural resources that we have that enabled our city to work. Boy, I tell you, there are many, many more reasons to have open government and open data in a government. It lets people see not only what you're doing, but it also provides an opportunity for people in your community to mine the data that you collect, not only for the goals that you can identify, and we've identified some of the needs, and as you've just heard, in housing or in affordability or with homelessness, where we set out with a specific end in mind, and we're making the data available to help achieve that. But oftentimes there's a benefit in just making data available and recognizing that government is not smart enough or creative enough or clever enough or has the resources to actually recognize all of the benefit that could come from data. So when we live in a world that government no longer can be expected to solve municipal challenges or public challenges, you really need the private sector taking a look at those same challenges and trying to figure out how to solve them in new and different ways, and then to be able to monetize those solutions so that they become sustainable. But it really is, the data is the intersection of government and business and institutions. You'll hear some of that. You have some of my favorite people in the city on this next panel that you have, Mimi and the others. The work that you're doing in and around data is just critical for governments, for the public to be able to solve the challenges that we face, to be able to do it in a way that is objective and measurable and not just anecdotal, but to actually achieve results. And it involves at the very beginning as an ante of government stepping forward and just removing the curtains and saying, here we are, for better or for worse. Tell us what we're doing right and wrong. See what we're doing right and wrong. And this data that is a public asset and a public resource that belongs to the public needs to be made available so that we can all make the most of it. So a great session and a great panel, including one of our national leaders in Governor O'Malley. I've always been a fan, back from the time that he was a mayor, which is the best thing that you can say about anybody, because of the tactical approach, but leading in open data in ways that I think served as the basis and the foundation for a lot of the open data stuff that President Obama later implemented. Have a great time.
That was my introduction. Thank you. Hey, let's give it up for Mayor Adler. Mayor, thank you very much, and thanks for your kind introduction, and thank you especially for the outstanding job you're doing, your government folks, and really the people of Austin. This is my first time at South by Southwest, not my first time in Austin, but my first time at South by Southwest, where joy and learning intersect. So, and it's great to be here also with the folks from Grant Thornton, who I've been honored to work with, doing some really exciting stuff. You'll hear from Robert Shea shortly on the panel, who did a lot of seminal work on the federal level in laying out the statutory framework, if you will, for evidence-based policy. I want to thank the Data Coalition and everybody else, all of you who took the time to be here. So look, I have some framing remarks for you, and I want to begin by letting you know that We're going to be talking on the panel, of course, and you know this, or you would not, or you would be someplace else, about open data, right? Evidence-based policy making. We're going to be talking about performance management, continuous improvement. And you'll be glad to know that to save you time, I have scoured the internet looking for the earliest presidential wisdom I could find on that topic. But in one of the shortcomings of the modern age, if you had typed those in as keywords, you would not have found this quote. And I am going to read it to you, verbatim. The quote goes like this. Quote, if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, here at South by Southwest, who was it? Who was the great American president who said those words? Hint, more than 50 years ago. The tip was the word wither. Do you know who it was? Roosevelt. Not Roosevelt? Not Thomas Jefferson? Robert, my favorite Republican. Who was it? Abraham Lincoln, Robert. Very good. He saw the crib notes last night over a beer, I do believe. But think about that, right? You know, as Americans, when we're at our best in terms of being a government of, by, and for the people, it's because we recognize that we're all engaged in a longitudinal experiment, right, Mayor? You try things, you see if they work. If they don't, you do different things. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to also key off something that Mayor Adler, one of the great mayors in America today, keyed in on, and that is the importance of trust. Progress moves at the speed of trust. And what I mean by that is this. There is a balance, a symmetry, if you will, between how well we govern ourselves and how capable we are of trusting one another. And in a democracy, there's an inseparable relationship between the two. They can build each other up, they can reinforce each other, or they can drag each other down. True story. A few months after the inauguration of our current president, I found myself teaching up at Boston College, and I was invited by the young Democrats, college Democrats of Suffolk College, to speak. And they were awesome. A little down in the heart, but they were awesome. They were fearless about the future. They exemplified and epitomized so many of the things that make us optimistic about tomorrow. And when I opened up the floor for questions, a young man in the front row, and you always had to be wary, Christian, of the young men in the front row. Young man in the front row raises his hand. And he says, my question for you is this. He said, what do you believe is the single biggest issue facing our country? Good question. In fact, having come off an all too brief run for president, I also knew it was the type of question that political consultants get paid lots of money to train their candidates never, ever, ever to answer. Because if you fall into the trap of answering what is the single biggest, most important issue, then every other issue isn't one of your top priorities. And that's not a good position to be in. So the red light was going off in my head, but hey, I was liberated. I had been promoted to the rank of citizen. So I repeated the question slowly, what is the biggest single issue facing our country? And then the truth came out. Trust, or a lack of trust, is the biggest single issue facing our country. And I looked around the room of those millennials, and I didn't have to explain. I didn't have to. They knew. It's going to be up to their generation to unpack all of the baggage that prior generations have built up in our country against the media, lack of trust against science, against national government, political parties, political institutions, big banks, millionaires, billionaires, the elites, this ethnic group, that religious group, and worst of all, against each other. You know, today, according to a recent poll, 1 out of 5 Americans actually answers that they're open to the notion of their own state's secession from the Union. 1 out of 5. And guess what, my fellow Americans? It's not just in the states of the historic Confederacy. It's in Silicon Valley, and it's in Boston, and other places where some of us might prefer to be domiciled in the cloud than domiciled in the country. Separation, disintegration, building walls. And yet, in America, there's always a yet. The anger, rage, and retribution of 2016 is behind us. A period of involution before a greater period of evolution. The public mood and the national consciousness is shifting. And now, having broken the table of our national democracy, we have the ability to repair it, put it back together, make it stronger, more inclusive, and more resilient than it was. And open data is a big, big part of that. The ability to model, measure, and map our natural and our built environments and the human dynamics and interactions that unfold and play out across them and pulse across them. The ability to make policy decisions based on evidence rather than ideology or the way we've always done it. The ability to get important and meaningful things done in ways that all of us can see and measure in real time. To better judge what to do and how to do it. And it all depends on trust. And in the information age, open data is the opening ante in that game of trust. But it won't happen by itself. Each of us is needed. So let's bring on our panel. And as we listen to this conversation, let's also think about ways that we can advance the direction of our country, which always leads to a tomorrow that's more inclusive, more open, and more trusting of one another. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Governor. Let's bring up our panel. Robert, you want to be down here? Sir. Got to keep him in line. So we talked about the theme of today, which is transparency outside, management efficiency inside. So what I'm going to do is quickly introduce our panel, but I'll kick it off with kind of a description of what we're really here to talk about, the Open Government Data Act, that new federal law that we have, and then we're going to slide through, talk about where that came from, how the government's using data, and then get to more of an external focus about civic tech and innovation at the local and state levels and nationally. So just wanted to start off quickly with intros, but we have Robert Shea here, principal with Grant Thornton Public Sector. Robert was a former associate director of the White House Office of Management and Budget in 2002 to 2008. And most recently, he was a commissioner on the Commission of Evidence-Based Policymaking. And he'll talk about the perspective kind of from that. And then we have Kate Nicole Kiley, co-founder of XD, a data AI-focused federal development service helping agencies leverage emerging tech and deliver critical citizen services. She's also head of user insight and design at the Census Bureau and was a former White House Presidential Innovation Fellow for the Obama administration in 2015. Next, we have Susan Alsner, co-founder and chief of strategy at Sxsw, and I hope you explain where that came from. It's pretty cool. And she started this company with former White House CTO Megan Smith. Sxsw is advancing tech across the nation with open and shareable practices to drive direct impact on systemic challenges. And previously, Susan led public engagement at the UN for 8 years. And last, we have Mimi Stiles, president and founder at the local nonprofit Measure, used to be called Measure Austin. But I guess you have a broader focus now? Yep. They're a research and advocacy organization that empowers people to use data to tell their own story and build trust and measurable progress between people and the institutions they need to change and leverage. So it's a great model there. I hope you mentioned the CARE model. So, but first, the background. And I think a bunch of you picked up a copy of the section-by-section summary of the Open Government Data Act, which we're going to talk about and where that came from. If you don't have that, you can go to the Data Coalition's Twitter, just at Data Coalition, and I think it was tweeted out in a link within the hour, but you can grab that to follow along. But we wouldn't really be here if it wasn't for kind of more of the foundational work that the last administration did with the 2013 executive order for an open and machine-readable government. And that management memorandum that resulted from that executive order, call it M1313, it's my favorite memo, really did two things. It set up data.gov, which is still live, and if you go there, you'll see 216,000 federal data assets mapped and inventoried, and they'll tell you kind of metadata, how to download it in various formats and where to get it and who maintains it. But you also see about 17,000 state data assets, as well as 8,000 municipal, and then some academic ones. But big agencies there mapping their data: Department of Commerce, NASA, Interior, Energy, EPA, HHS, the Veteran Health Administration. Each of those agencies have over 1,000 data assets mapped. But we know that we're barely like 1/4 compliant with that, even though it's still on the books. Next, the management memorandum, for the first time at the federal level, codified open data principles. And this is kind of critical, and those have been kind of mapped on Project Open Data, which you can find on cio.gov. But this was the first time that we got these principles encoded, and I'm going to read them off because that's really kind of what we're talking about. Open data should be public, accessible, described, so like the metadata, reusable, so open licenses, complete, source level, timely, to preserve the value, and managed post-release, so you have confidence that what you're looking at is actually real and is being used. So those have been around and being enforced in various extents, but they weren't law. So in 2014, Senators Sass of Nebraska and Brian Schatz of Hawaii introduced the Open Government Data Act, which sought to codify the executive order. And I have to give a shout out to Sasha Moss, sitting over here. Wave. Wave again. In 2015, she was a congressional staffer, a legislative counsel in the House, and helped draft the original version of this. So she gets gets a shout out. It's all the quiet work. But later on, the bill was incorporated into former House Speaker Ryan and current Senator Patty Murray's Bipartisan Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act as Title II. So that's really where it lives, and Robert's going to give some background there, but largely, the Open Government Data Act serves up the data to the questions that the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act seeks to answer. So it's broadly a data management bill now. And quickly what it does, and this is key, it establishes a legal government-wide presumption of openness that rests on the Freedom of Information Act. So it defines key terms. So the first time in law, we have a definition for data, data asset, machine readable, metadata, and other things, open license. So those definitions can be leveraged in other bills, and we're actively kind of seeding that out through draft legislation. But I'll read the definition of public data asset, because this is critical, and it's now in law. Public data asset means a data asset or part thereof maintained by the federal government that has been or may be released to the public, including any data asset subject to FOIA. So then it requires that every federal agency goes about mapping these data assets. It empowers CDOs at every agency. They'll be creating agency data management plans. And then they'll be proactively disclosing this information on data inventories at each agency. And all that maps up to data.gov, which will now be codified. Then it has some other kind of house cleaning things, like establishing a CDO council so they can all coordinate formally through the White House. But that's pretty much what the bill does. And kind of as I said before, there's really no point to this if we don't use it and turn it into action, both within the agencies, within Congress for oversight, but also externally for watchdogs and the public. So I'm going to kick it over to Robert Shea, who's going to tell you more of the broader context of why this was all necessary and needed.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Christian. Christian asked me to take you on a walk down memory lane. So forgive me the storytelling. During the Bush administration, we undertook an assessment of all federal programs. And in doing so, asked to what extent these programs had been evaluated. And in the early days, the evaluations they provided didn't really meet a standard of rigor that would allow you to judge whether the program was achieving its intended goals. So we worked really hard to strengthen the guidelines agencies use to design evaluations and ensure that they were independent and rigorous. This effort was sustained into the Obama administration, and practices began to emerge across agencies that strengthened the evaluation capacity and the use of those evaluations at departments. There was, but often when you require a program to undergo an evaluation of this sort, it can be very expensive, very time consuming. There are ethical questions to consider. And so a number of agencies began to link data sets. As you can imagine, the government collects more data on Americans than you could possibly imagine. If we can unlock some of that data, link some of it securely, then we can get better insights about what programs are working. Fast forward to budget negotiations between Speaker Ryan and Patty Murray. They forged a strong bipartisan working relationship. And when considering things to work on together, they decided to invest their political capital in strengthening evidence-based policymaking across government. They created a commission, not the strongest move, but nonetheless, it was an opening gambit to begin this effort. And so the commission met for about 17 months, came up with a number of what I consider common sense recommendations. I was on the commission, that formed the basis of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. And those that made those initial recommendations that made their way into the bill create evaluation officers in each federal department who's charged with working with programs to come up with an evaluation agenda called a learning agenda. What are the big questions we want to ask about our programs? And then coordinate with the chief data officer to go and get those questions answered. One of the recommendations that did not make it into that bill was proposed yesterday in the president's budget, a U.S. federal data service. We on the commission studied myriad countries' efforts to create or improve data linkages at the federal level. And so we decided, modeled on a census entity, the Center for Administrative Records Access, that provides a very secure environment in which researchers can access multiple data sets securely. And so the theory is this new unit will be a CARA on steroids, providing central governance and access to data for researchers to unlock insights into programs. It'll be up to policymakers to take the results of these evaluations and use them to make programs work better. So it'll take a lot of community pressure, continued congressional action, but a leadership across the federal government and in communities all across the country, because it's not just federal data sets, but it's linking data sets in the custody of state and local governments and other organizations. How's that? Great.
Hey there. So I actually was really lucky, probably thanks to Robert, to join my stint in public service from the private sector in 2015. So I very much felt when I entered that I was in the moment, right? I was like in the momentum behind the open data movement at the time was obvious, it was palpable, data.gov and these other things had just happened. And we started to ask ourselves, so I joined as a Presidential Innovation Fellow for the Obama administration. We ended up doing a lot of projects in the area. We started to ask ourselves, like, what to use it, right? Like we kind of realized there were some things that were being used. There were other things that were great assets that maybe like weren't even being touched. Why? You know, how come? What was going on? We came up with a couple of different theories. We tried a bunch of things. Much like the fellows program is, you know, there really are like brief stints and trying to move fast and kind of like see what was working. One result of that was a project that we started called the Opportunity Project. It's still going today, which is really cool. It's basically like, could you take community leaders and tech teams and curate data sets in ways and link them so that you actually increase access to opportunity and however that neighborhood wants to define that thing. If you're interested, you actually can, like this is like something you can go do if you're interested. They do sprints on a regular basis. You can just check it out at opportunity.census.gov. But now, basically, we had the awesome opportunity to join. So Luke, fellow co-founder, we said, there's so much work to do in this space. The PIF program worked. Now we have a bunch of people staying in government. They say, come for a year. You know, just do a year. We're all still there and recruiting more people. So the great part is we're growing. XD is actually mostly focused on infusing emerging technologies into government to help agencies rethink how they're delivering their mission, right? So you can imagine there's tons of these like statistical agencies, surveys that happen all the time. We can say, you know, will 2030 really look like this? Probably not. Let's think about how we are actually going to think how that data is going to flow in 2030. Are we going to knock on people's doors anymore? So a lot of the projects that we do are, so a few examples. If it's helpful, because one, I'm here to help you use things and use me to the best of whatever your projects need. So, so we have a project. It's very early stages, but some exemplar are working at HUD with the login.gov team. So if you haven't heard of login.gov, basically you'll have one government account that will authenticate you across for all these services in the future. It could also, maybe one day you could imagine you have all your data there, you can streamline eligibility. And in the government-assisted housing example, you could say, well, why isn't there a national wait list in a unified application? So that's like a project we're working on today, hopefully to leapfrog what would not have been possible without this kind of like baseline foundation. Another one is building a tool to help agencies understand and combat their bias in their data sets and their training sets. Everything from that to kind of like using these prototyping mechanisms, building things to understand how we might like find out what would fail when we think about what the future of data maturation in government is. So all that to say, if there's things that, questions I can answer or things that I can do to be helpful, I hope I can be for you. Oh, we got one. Awesome.
Hi, everyone. Susan Alsner, one of the co-founders of Sxsw with Megan Smith and another woman, Punita Hira, who both worked in the CTO office. Megan was the CTO and Punita was a special assistant. I want to come at this conversation from a slightly different angle and especially focused on what Governor O'Malley was talking about with regard to trust and the case for public sector open data. I met Megan while I was working at the UN. As Christian mentioned, I was in charge of public engagement for 8 years, and that included for the negotiations of the Sustainable Development Goals. Have any of you heard of these? So this is this agenda agreed by all world leaders that are member states of the UN, which is not all countries of the world, it's all member states, which is 193. It's a significant achievement, and it's the first time in history that world leaders have acknowledged that there are 3 dimensions for sustainable development: environment, social, and economic, not just social and economic. The old paradigm used to be leaving out the environment. So in the process to negotiate these goals, there was a call from the world for it to be a much more inclusive process, and there was an enormous amount of pressure on the UN system for how could you possibly consult with 7 billion people. So the tech response had to be robust because we couldn't do that at scale without some sort of technology. So there were all different types of approaches, but how I see this connected to this panel was that an enormous amount of information started coming at the UN, and the management of it was really tricky, including regarding safety for individuals sending their views from countries that aren't democracies, for example. So some of the protection dimensions came squarely into focus. And the other question that came squarely into focus is who owns this data? And so, that is still unresolved. But I think it's a really interesting area for explanation when governments and citizens are trying to get more in relationship around data. And you brought up the issue of maturation. One of the things that we encountered is there was really, really strong youth engagement from around the world, but their perspectives are changing rapidly as they're learning. So if they're sending us information about themselves and their views and they're 14, by the time they're 15, their views could be quite different. So should we hold that data set as emblematic of what they think? And so, you know, these questions are also still unresolved. But I wanted to introduce some of that for consideration here, and kind of close on one aspect, which now is still a big focus for us now that I've joined Sxsw. We still have work that we do with the UN to try to keep these conversations going, but on the trust component, what's really most particularly fascinating for us is how is government in particular receiving information about not only what the community thinks, but what the community is doing already. And how are we handling that kind of data? Like, especially your work, I think, will point to this. At the local level, people already have solutions underway to most of our challenges. If we found them and supported them, we would accelerate the changes we need to see. And I love the Austin Open Data Portal, in particular because it let me see this really cool chart. If you haven't seen it yet, the top 10 searches on what people are interested in the Open Data Portal. Have any of you seen this? On the Austin Open Data. It's fascinating. The number one is probably not that surprising. It's about 30% of people are searching on jobs. But I bet number two is going to surprise you. It's dogs. And I'm pretty convinced it's probably because Austin seems to have an absolutely extraordinary, exemplary way to reveal that you've found a lost dog and help people find it, which seems to have been built off of an open data set. I'm not sure, but it's really something. I mean, I wish I had this in my community. So it literally maps where the dog was found and has a picture of the dog. So if you want to try to find your dog, you can just go to this website now. It's a lot easier than hanging a sign in your town. But anyway, I think that, you know, this is an example of some team, I guess, that developed this, but to have more of a focus on what's already underway and, you know, helping those kinds of teams to engage in this kind of work, I would, you know, that's what Sxsw is about. Sxsw, when you type it to answer your question, you get "and" on the keyboard. It's about inclusive collaboration using tech-forward innovation to solve problems. So I guess we'll talk more about that later, but thank you.
Hey, my name is Mimi Stiles. I get to be the president of an amazing organization called Measure. We are a group of researchers, activists, advocates, community members that are just really interested in how data is used in order to address disparities. And so just, I guess, a couple reflections. You know, how the governor had mentioned, you know, trust definitely is, especially in my community, one of the key issues in America. But as my partner would mention, it's not just trust, right? It's like trustworthiness, right? And so when we talk about trustworthiness and how government institutions can become more trustworthy, that then takes the onus off of just the people, and especially the people that are feeling the disparity or experiencing the disparity, that then leads to, you know, data, right? That is disproportionately impacting people that look like us. So our organization is pretty interesting. You know, we've been able to capitalize on a model called the CARE model. Is this an appropriate time to kind of talk about that? Cool. So the CARE model is our blueprint in order to create change, and using data in order to create this change. And so if you're taking notes, CARE, super innovative. We thought about it at Starbucks. We were tasked with going into a community that has high crime, and going into that community and trying to create better relationships between police and the community members that live there. And so my partner and I were thinking, like, okay, so how do we do this without, first of all, colonizing this area and saying, this is what you need, right? This is what the data says about you. This is how we need to fix your problem. Instead, we thought, no, we need to go in there with care. And so the C starts with, anyone want to guess? That's a really great guess, actually. But no, it's actually community. So we started with C, with community, A, with advocacy, R, with resilience, and then E, with evidence. And so what that looks like is that now we are community-led, but we are evidence and data-driven, right? And so that is the way that we break up our organization to tackle so many different problems. Whether it is dismantling the curfew law here in Austin, which we did successfully because we found that the data did not support what they were trying to do with that curfew law, whether it be going into a school and noticing that more Black and brown kids were being charged with assault, and then helping the school to then change the policies and create task force and work groups in order to change that disparity. Whether it be just future, hopefully going and understanding what type of environmental structural issues are then leading to high crime in neighborhoods, whether it be a street light that is just that's been broken for way too long, then creating more crime in a particular area. And so with the CARE model, we're able to create change. We're able to give the power of data to the people. I like to say, and I hope, I'm sure that you guys may have heard this, but data is truly the new utility, right? It's just as raw as, as water, as gas, electricity. And so when you give that to the people, and when they're able to really create their own, use it in order to create new outcomes, then you're really empowering the people. So I'm really excited to be here. If you are interested in how to meaningfully engage community members around data, I am your person, and I'm the mayor's favorite person.
Thanks, guys. Let's just start from the top. What aspects of the Open Government Data Act are you most excited about leveraging for your work? And I'd also just open that up to, could the bill have gone further, and kind of what other federal reforms do you want to see? And we'll talk about state and local later.
Well, I mean, you're calling it the Open Data Act. I'm, as you know, I think about the broader framework, evidence-based policymaking. So I think the learning agendas that agencies will begin to develop and contract for evaluations around shows great promise.
Yeah, super quickly, obviously having machine readable aspects of it are super critical to what we do every day. But besides that, I think a lot of behind XD's theory of change anyway is draw more really great talent into government in this way. So the CDO, especially having chief data officers and then giving them the space to do what they need to do will be huge, I think.
What I'm excited to see is how the compliance is going to go. So, for example, I would like to learn a lot more about the actual condition of energy development in this country, and seeing more data, on how the transition is going to a more climate-friendly world would be interesting. And given this was a bipartisan bill, I'm hoping that is another realm in which science and data can help neutralize some of the politics on what's an otherwise too controversial issue that shouldn't be very controversial. So looking forward to that.
So I am probably the most bipolar data activist in this room. By day, I am actually a privacy officer. And then by night, I work to open data. And so I'm most excited about the establishment of the CDOs. I would like to see that then filter down to the local level. And then I would also like to see, of course, I always have to push, right? That's what I do. So I would like to see the establishment of privacy officers as well, to ensure that we're also being very responsible when we talk about open data.
Great. And then I guess, what federal data assets are you currently using? You can talk about state and local data assets, and I'd be curious about kind of the aspects of those data assets and what makes them most usable for your work.
Yeah, I guess. Well, so honestly, it's a combination for us of open and not yet. Might be soon, but it is actually nice to be able to be in a place where we can say, we might want to do this combating bias project. We partner with a few agencies to say what would that look like, and then we, through that you can kind of infuse a little bit of change management in there. You could say, well, we could open this up. But I think for us, it's mostly, I think I'll be very interested in the challenge, especially on like the HUD project, let's say, when you do have to scale to, like, the scaling has always been the hardest part in every project I've ever done in government, right? It's like the connection of federal, state, local, et cetera, and or public housing authorities being able to share with HUD in just like real time, safe, secure ways. I don't know if that's like I think the assets that are most exciting are also like the most challenging, but difficult for me, I guess.
I'll take that question in the terms of, I think Los Angeles has a really interesting model that people could look at. They created a data science federation, and I was trying to figure out how much of the data that they're working with is open, but they, like Austin, have an open data platform, so there's lots to draw on. But what's really interesting about their model is they're teaming up with 12 universities currently, and that's growing, as well as other stakeholders in the community to help achieve projects that can help to benefit projects with data science as requested by the various city agencies. So they have a really highly collaborative model, and they're looking to help share their lessons learned and their best practices, et cetera, with others. So if anybody's interested in that, I can help introduce you to that team. It's really exciting what they're doing.
So most of the data that we're using right now usually is connected to a problem. So, and then not only just connected to a problem, but almost like a rebuttal to what a narrative is right now. So one of the narratives that we had to really take on was like, is crime increasing? Right? We start with the question. And so we may look at like the National Crime Information Database to let us know that, you know what, no, crime is not increasing. We should not put our we should not put our money towards the increase in police officers in this area, because it's just not. And not only that, but we know that because it has been on a decline since the 90s. And so that type of data is allowing us to make more evidence-based decisions in the act, as an activist. So now we're not just going and standing in front of city council with gut emotion or feeling, but instead we now are empowered with data in order to push the envelope even further.
The commission recommended the increased sharing of some of the most sensitive data sets that the government collects, and recommended also that there not be future limitations on the sharing of data so long as there's strong governance and privacy protections over that data. So, though not open data, I'm excited to see where we go with getting access to that data. But the results of evaluations that are conducted under this framework are required to be published publicly. It'll be incumbent on the evaluation officers to ensure these are written in an accessible way, and I don't mean technically accessible, I mean so that the results are written in a way that's easily understandable, so that the chances it's used in policymaking increase.
And that's getting back to like the problem it's trying to tackle.
That's right.
Yeah. Just a quick question. I've heard the word available. Is there a meaningful difference between data that's available versus accessible? Again, I could reframe it. Inventories just for the sake of inventories versus things that are helping you find linked data and really connect to other users and discover stuff that you can actually use.
So you answered your own question.
Yeah, I guess.
Anybody want to?
Yeah, so I can kind of I can contribute to that question. So I like to say that open databases should be simple. Like, first of all, realize the reason why you are opening your database. It's to empower the people, right? So that's step one. You're not doing it, and hopefully you're not just doing it just because the law says to do it now, but instead to really take an internal look at your organization or the institution by which you work. And so when I say smart, databases should be smart. Number one, they should be simple. what software is being used to collect the data, who's actually creating the the surveys to collect this data? Are you using a 21st century solution, so forth? Is it measurable, right? What targets are you working to improve over time? Is it actionable? Are the actions taking building better outcomes for residents or those that are mostly being impacted? Is it relational, right? Is the data being used is the data going to be weaponized on a community? Or is it actually going to perpetuate even more community harm? That means we have to really dig into our data sets right now so that it does not perpetuate maybe even racism. So asking those kind of questions. And then lastly, how transparent is it? And is privacy prioritized when releasing these data sets?
That's pretty comprehensive. Thanks. Susan, in your opening remarks, you talked about the importance of discovering work that's already being done so you can leverage that first. Are there parallels when you're working with data about the owners of the data asset and how they're releasing it? Should they be aware of who's using the data and how to really form a relationship with them to get those feedback loops? And if so, how? And I guess, Kate, if you have some perspectives in your work.
I think that's a real frontier issue, personally. At least I can draw on my experience from the UN for that one in particular. We were doing some pretty advanced information exchange, even on topics as complex as how should the UN reform itself. So we asked the world in all languages to send in their recommendations that would go directly to the Deputy Secretary General's team. So let me introduce the concept of that as a data set, right? This is like views from all over the world. Another one was, what are your questions for the candidates for Secretary General? And it probably might seem like that can't have been a real thing that you did. Would the candidates really listen to the questions of the world? Well, they did, because I negotiated that. But we got 500 million impressions on Twitter and 28,000 questions. It's quite a data set, right? So to what extent was that then accessible, malleable, et cetera? You know, what analytics can you run on it? And all of this. And I had been for years trying to, with the success of the engagement and the availability of all of this data at the UN, I was trying to get the various offices, I won't name them, but to help me build a platform that would enable interaction, right? But they weren't ready for that because it introduced too much work. So I wanted to say the notion of this is probably a big challenge to any entity that would have an enormous influx of information, the interactivity of it in public service. But in terms of coming back to the point of building trust, I think it's the most important thing to do. And the challenge I would also put forward, and I think this is the future really after, you know, we get a little bit further down the road with some of what's happening with these social media platforms, is people need to really own this data and control it themselves so that they can edit it. And it's like a packet that they can determine how many pieces intersect with which platform and turn a switch on, turn a switch off, something along these lines. Because the other thing that we experienced at the UN, coming back to my earlier point of the maturation issue, is if I'm somebody and I want to have an open data set, I'm somebody who, let me separate the roles. I'm the one receiving the data. I've got all this data from people in 2016 of what they wanted to ask the Secretary General candidates. Some of the things that happened where people campaigned with it. The campaign at the time was what happened in Haiti in terms of the cholera outbreak. I don't know how many of you know about this, but it was something that was caused by UN peacekeeping troops. And because of the open data set that was available due to the questions of the Secretary General's candidates, the UN apologized for that finally, only because so many questions came in about Haiti cholera, right? So that's a point in time. But now, are those issues still relevant? Like, how did it evolve? It can't change. It's like static. So there's just, I think, a lot of work to be done on helping this to live through time like humans do and not be fixed. Sorry for the long answer, but I think this is a really complicated question.
I totally agree. It's like a very complicated question because you're getting into kind of like not just a data challenge, like a design challenge, and like I guess like one very small specific way which we found to do this was we were working on Vice President Biden's Cancer Moonshot Initiative in the clinical trial aspect of this, and said like basically you have a ton of trials data. It was really messy, right? You went on to you went into NCI. You're in this terrible state. You just heard something. You know, you heard what you'd never want to hear, whether it was you or a family member, and then you'd try to see what was out there for you, and you'd go in and search something, and the thing that came back was like not at all what you needed to hear. Like it was structured as kind of like a L1, 2, B3, like in the way that the researchers had named that thing or the very specific, genetic mutation. We ended up like sitting with enough patients, right? Like you hear how they're describing how that, and actually we learned over time that like you as a patient would describe in version 1 of receiving that information, as you started to kind of like learn more and more and more about your type of cancer, it would get more specific for you, right? You might change the way that you describe that, and so we actually ended up working with NCI in the back end of that data problem to say, well, okay, we're going to have to serve up trial information in this way when it's very early. This is that type of thing that they're going to type in. Let's either match it or be able to serve that data up so someone actually knows that there's a trial that they can enter into. Later on, they're going to identify it as this. How do we make sure that those same trials are available in all the ways that made sense? This is like a very small, specific example, but like when you start to scale out past those like small, specific use cases, it just gets like exponentially more complicated. So I think how we've approached this is basically one, from a staffing side, we just put a designer and a data person on like every project together. Like usually we try to diversify project teams as much as possible and keep them small. And the other is trying to just like scope down in a prototyping way, right? Like scope to the most specific thing you can, and then kind of worry about the scaling mechanisms where it's going to fail when you scale, like as a result of what you've learned from that first small prototyping.
So every agency is going to have a learning agenda. They're going to have a list of the questions they're trying to get answers to through evaluations. It's an enormous opportunity to find cross-cutting problems that you can build communities of learning around. First thing we got to do is understand what's going on under our own roofs. I was with the lead for evidence-based policy making at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and after several weeks of hunting around, they're like, we do a lot of research. Well, of course, you've got like one of the, if not the largest hospital systems in the world. Enormous research being done there. So, but we've got to be really intentional about driving that collaboration and learning across those agendas and not let them remain in agency silos.
A question that just popped in my mind, Mimi, you said in answering the question between available versus accessible that it's important that they take an internal look, and to Robert's comment about being aware of what you have, what's the balance between these policy reforms and how the federal caretakers will react, and on one hand rushing to just get everything online and out in public versus being a little bit more methodical about going through and seeing, okay, we may have like 5 different things, we could release them all, or do we want to try to reconcile them and release something of higher value so that we have, I guess, more simple, targeted public sector data assets available? I know that's a loaded question, but.
Yeah, and I'm sure that we all can kind of contribute to that one. I guess my piece in there would be, it would be really important to first ask, right? Ask the people how collaborative is your data release process. If it's just happening within a small room, an upper room in that office, then there's a problem, right? Because you're not really going to offer anything that's going to be a solution for people. And so that's number one, is to really ask the people. And then, I keep wanting to go back to that piece of like, how can open data be used negatively? How can it be weaponized against communities? And so I would think that, that agencies would really look at what that open data can do, whether it can create more harm or not, right? And then I would also want to make sure that when we do release this data is, are we accounting for equity when we're releasing this data, like so that people like me and my organization can actually use this information? Are we taking account of race when we're talking about certain data sets? Are we even accounting for ethnicity or language when we're talking about releasing data sets? So I would hope that it's going to be like phases, right? And that you're not just going to dump it on people and say here, because that's what has, in many cases, like even the open data sets that we have right now, the average Joe is not going to be able to even understand, or they're not able to really understand what some of that data looks like, and so yeah, definitely methodical is what I would hope for.
Last night there was another panel at the LBJ school, and Governor O'Malley mentioned that it's important to not only just put the data out there in a structured form, but also to leverage visualization platforms and other ways that make the data as broadly accessible and readable to both internal actors that may or not be data scientists but come from other legal or academic humanities disciplines, as well as the public, so everyone's kind of speaking the same language, and then you can deep dive from there. We've been talking a lot about kind of more the human use and how groups use data, but in terms of just the emerging tech out there and how we're going to put out data so that people can innovate off of it, I was kind of hopeful that some of you can shed some light about what would make open data usable to emerging tech, whether that's robotic process automation and other apps that are being developed. And that was a fundamental principle of the law, is that making it bulk downloadable, available under an open license allows for that reuse, so that people can innovate off of it.
Well, I guess like in one way, what's particularly interesting around like the data visualizations in general too is like, we've done a project a few years ago on this, which basically helped to create standards for data visualizations, kind of specific to statistical agencies. So you can imagine you would go around to the federal statistical system, and honestly, like we really do struggle. Like there's a lot of work to do. These places are often small. They are used to putting out PDFs with tables in them. Like it's just like natural habit. We actually saw one of those like old, like it's like I don't even know what you call them. They're like the old. It's like a giant film roll and they were like, this is what we released. And you're just kind of like,
I'm getting real depressed up here.
It was like, wow, that's amazing.
It looked like this.
It's like, I'm gonna be like, a cassette tape. No. Yeah, exactly. No. And I mean, in lots of ways, I think one of the challenges is like, so many data visualizations across government are still stuck in these PDFs. So they are extremely valuable, or in other mediums, yes. So like one thought would be we could apply some really cool things to be able to even just gather that knowledge, right? Like and transfer it into these new mechanisms that would make it newly available. The other thought is even just a baseline. Let's use some visualizations that we've helped to put out just through census, where hopefully this is adoptable. The user group is these statisticians, so it's adoptable by these statisticians, so that they feel good about the margin differences and kind of like the things that are very specific to data visualizations that we would just not use otherwise. But those are small examples.
I would add that government probably shouldn't break their pick on taking the data and converting it to visualization, and instead rely on the private sector to, or other, not just the private sector, in any entity to add that value, because I think you get myriad additional points of view added to that visualization.
Yeah, I would call those intermediary institutions: journalists, academia, watchdogs, Congress itself. So kind of let them mash together for their own uses, yeah. A couple more questions, then we'll go to the audience. But I guess just wanted to give you guys an opportunity to plug any state or local reforms that you're really excited about, that you think should be more broadly recognized and celebrated or leveraged across the rest of the country.
What O'Malley said.
Yeah, definitely. So our organization is now working here locally, the Texas legislation, with a joint resolution for evidence-based policing. And so we are encouraging evidence-based policing. We've partnered with the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. They're actually out in Sacramento, California, in order to create this grand idea of using evidence in order to inform the tactics, the practices, the policies, to take a better look at how maybe hotspot policing may not be good for a neighborhood, how it may be okay, how when an officer goes from call to call to call, like how that impacts their health and their wellness, to start looking a little bit deeper. And so definitely that joint resolution. And then if you're telling me that I can plug something, I'm going to plug something. So we are, our Measure, we're working in Houston right now on our workshop. It's called Big Data and Community Policing. And so what we do is we bring in developers, just tech folks in general, researchers, academics, activists, and police into one room for discussions about reimagining policing in our communities and what that looks like and how that intersects with the tech ecosystem and how we're creating these new records management systems and how they can be more equitable and more usable and provide better insights. And so it's called Big Data and Community Policing.
Actually, the example I have that I would like to highlight for everyone is more of an international one, but it connects back to local. It's called the Transparency, Accountability, and Participation Network. It's a number of NGOs and academics who have been trying to help call a number of things, but what I want to highlight for today is they want third-party data to be accepted by governments, local, state, and on up. And right now, for example, for the Sustainable Development Goals, if you wanted to monitor and evaluate progress on them, the only way right now for there to be an official perspective on that is through the National Statistics Offices, which you already just discussed the challenges that they have. So, and one of the main responses the NSOs will say is that it's too expensive to collect additional data beyond what they've already, have capabilities developed based on the needs for whatever. Now there's this whole new agenda with 17 goals and 169 targets and 244 indicators, and we can't monitor for that. So you would think partnership, which is actually goal 17 of the SDGs, would mean that they could partner with private sector, academia, and others on the collection and analysis of the data, but they're not doing that. And the network that's most engaged on that and most effective is this TAP network. So if anybody wants to help on that kind of front, definitely reach out to that group.
Final question, and this is a big one. What's your advice to the citizenry and how they can be more effective in their own advocacy, leveraging tech and open data resources to make informed arguments and participate in that accountability of their own government, and also to band together in civic discourse?
I mean, it's hard to recommend that every citizen take a basic statistics course because you'd like to see the citizenry understand some of the context of the data they have, and that's why it's so important, I think, to put all of this analysis into accessible context. But the number one thing the citizenry can do is demand of their leaders that they post that data in an understandable way, and to increase the publication of data that provides transparency into the way governments are operating.
Yeah, I mean, I think specific to probably how it intersects with XD and me would be specific examples of things you need and or things you're trying to accomplish. Like if you're in a place where you're building a thing and we were just thinking to me, it's like, hey, could census data be helpful? Like let's talk about that. Or if you're trying to scale and you're trying to say, okay, we have this kind of local data we know we're gonna need this other stuff. Those aspects are really helpful, I think. But other than just, continuing to push me. Call me up and say, you answer to me, Kate. Like you pay my salary. So I am personally grateful for the continued push of all of you, right? As someone who's a federal employee looking to push a very large ship in a certain direction. So one, thanks already for being here and for your advocacy. And two, if there's things that I can do to help your projects, I would love to do that.
Just on the theme of what citizens can advocate for, in addition to do, personally, especially given what I've seen happen with the global context, where you have developing countries who can't be expected to resource initiatives to the same level of developed countries, I would say the same thing for government versus citizenry, or government, private sector, and citizenry. I feel like capacity building programs are a responsibility. They should be provided for citizens to engage in. We can't just open data and be like, good luck, hope you can figure it out in your, spare time. I think that it really should be on, again, I like partnership models. Sxsw in general is about partnership. So, what can be constructed where the government is working together with academia in particular, but also maybe there's a sponsorship by a private sector entity that helps provide the capacity building so citizens can understand much more quickly how they could contribute to solution making in their community level using the data that's now been made available.
Yeah, just to echo what Susan just mentioned, just being very intentional about keeping those that are most impacted close. And that may look as simple as partnering with organizations like hers or partnering with organizations like mine that are at the ground level. And so, yeah, that's what I would say is just, become a data activist in your organization. If you see that the power of data in your organization can actually make change, well, be a part of that change. Step out of your box.
Great. Well, that's it for the easy questions. Now we're turning it over to you guys. Hope you have something ready, and I'll just run the mic around. Name, affiliation, and keep it brief.
Hi, I'm Tracy Adams. I have a software company called ACS Propel. I'm wondering how much control would a city government have over the ownership of data, like scooter data? Can they mandate that must be shared? Is that under this federal bill or the stuff that you talked about, or is that still kind of city to city?
It's not under the federal bill. I'm not aware of. I know that this is a controversial topic. I'm not aware of an effort to give government custody of any of that, custody or access to that data by statute. So right now it would be city by city.
My name's Neil Falgu. I'm an attorney with the City of Austin Law Department in the Open Government Division. My question really is for Mimi, and it has to do with data equity. So one of the things that the City of Austin does is we do a community-wide survey every year, collects a lot of data. One of the things we've struggled with is identifying queer communities, and how do we identify those people and all the rainbow of identities that can be included in that sort of data. So that's one situation. The second situation would be like disparities in police reporting. Like, I think it's pretty well understood that white communities report at higher rates than communities of color. So you are advocating on making decisions based on data. So how would you advocate a government make database decisions when the data that they're using might not adequately reflect marginalized communities?
Great questions. Okay, so question number one, talking about survey and having people that are not typically included to be more included in those surveys. So I would say when you create that survey, let me ask you a question. Are they included in the development of the survey?
Yeah, in fact, the city has an LGBTQ commission that's actually dealing with this question. Sorry. The city actually has an LGBTQ commission that is dealing with this issue right now and is sort of struggling to advise the city on how to deal with that.
Awesome. So and I asked that question because in many cases, those that are receiving the survey are more so feeling like they're being, scientifically evaluated without being within the process. So I'm glad that they are being included. And I would say, and I also say that because at Measure, what we do is that we partner with communities in order to create their own surveys. And then not only that, but that information and then should also be owned by them as well. So it sounds like you guys are doing what, the same process that we're doing right now. It would be great to reimagine how we can, push that even further together. And so the other question in regards to policing data, right? Like, yeah, right now, data sucks, right? Especially for communities of color. We're always being told that we are a statistic. I know that when I was 17 years old, and, I was told that I was a statistic, and it made me want to change that statistic that I was. And so, so what we're doing with Austin is we're actually working directly with Austin Police Department in order to talk about data and to reimagine how data could be actually useful. And so we have to be vulnerable when we open data, and we have to be humble. So that means that, some of the data the metadata may need to be different. We may need to completely get rid of some of the data sets that we have that are actually, perpetuating, again, racist systems. I hope that answers your question. So literally uprooting some of the ways that we release, capture, analyze, and so forth data and completely changing it. So this is a great opportunity to do that.
Hi, my name is Raymond. I'm an open government researcher here in the city. I work with Open Government Partnership, and I also work with a local group called Texas Justice Initiative, which Mimi's on the board. We haven't actually met before. So those are my two issue areas. And what I want to ask about is institutionalizing the participation of the community organizations that we do rely on for this kind of work. So Open Austin here does a lot of the work. But when you go beyond that and you look at how city governments and national governments are including community organizations, a lot of time that's voluntary. And a lot of times these types of principles can quickly change when we have institutional change or when we have transfer of power. So I was just curious how the different panelists feel we can best institutionalize the participation of marginalized communities in open data policy making.
I guess that's a really tough question. Being with Governor O'Malley the last couple of days, one of the things that you learn, there's a huge risk during political transitions that progress falls back. You saw it in Baltimore in the successive administrations that succeeded him. and you see it at the federal level from one president to another as new priorities emerge. I mean, the options are shame, right? Publicly post what an expectation is for integration of community groups in the effort, to making it a statutory requirement. That would, I assume, that would necessarily have to be on a case-by-case basis. I fear that that would. I feel that the richness of the organizations and the conversations would be diminished by that level of institutionalization. I don't know why. So it is that's a tough question.
You have to mobilize. I mean, it's really just that simple. We, at the UN, the only reason we were able to keep the open engagement practices that we were running going from administration to administration to administration is because there was such a massive call from civil society to keep it going. They didn't have a choice. Because I can tell you there's no way that the successive presidents of the General Assembly would have continued the practice. We had a couple of really great progressive open ones, but in between that, we had countries who were the opposite, but we were able to keep it going because they were pretty boxed in by, you know, the number of huge NGOs in particular that said this is not optional anymore. So I think, you know, it's basically lobbying, but for this kind of open engagement, I felt like civil society mobilization was the key.
I would say that the organizations that we're trying to include need to be sustained, right? So just as a prime example, most underserved organizations like mine, or Austin Justice Coalition, we can name several other black or brown organizations, are not fully sustained, right? Like, we live in two completely different realities when you talk about a group of people of color versus a more so white, right, nonprofit. So I would say cities can make sure that they are intentionally, you know, sustaining these organizations. One great example that you can look up, you can Google now, is out in Sacramento. They have an initiative called Measure U, and that is where they are actually, you know, reaching out to organizations that can go and mobilize communities in order to be a part of the process, but they're actually sustaining them. So a lot of times organizations like mine are given a whole lot of hope and, you know, can you help us do this? Can you help us do that? But we're building this huge foundation on toothpicks without that foundation. So it's really important to actually sustain organizations.
Hi, my name's Stefan Ray, and I work for the City of Austin. I work on the Open Data Program in public health. And the City of Austin, our Open Data Program actually exists based on council resolutions from a number of years ago and a city manager memorandum from 2015. But we don't have an ordinance governing our Open Data Program. And so I'm curious, this seems to be an opportunity right now for municipal governments to look at what happened at the federal level and start to translate some of those into local either resolutions or ordinances. Curious if you've heard of other cities starting to think about this, what movements might be going in that direction, and it seems like it would be helpful if there were some templates or models that could be easily transferred over into an ordinance that the City of Austin might want to adopt that would be in the same vein.
Yeah, super quickly, we had the pleasure of calling Michael Schnurley out of Louisville, who I don't know if you guys have heard of, but basically has managed to start, mobilize a bunch of cities in this area. So one, I would definitely check out the work. It's like some open government and data work out of Louisville, and happy to help make a connection if that's helpful. But that's the best one I've seen. Yes, I believe so, yeah.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm with the City of Austin also, and I'm looking at how to improve service delivery and make it more accessible, and I was wondering if you could speak to data as creating those feedback loops, how to institutionalize that. I think we collect a lot of data. I know I worked with a team that dealt with quantitative and qualitative data, and qualitative data is so rich, but we don't necessarily have the tools or the training a lot of times.
Yeah, and sorry, can I ask you a question back? Is that okay? What kind of services are you focused on, like hyper-focused on right now?
Well, right now we're looking at all city services, but I was originally looking at homelessness services, and yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think there's like a few. One, I guess like this is a hard answer, but it sounds like inherent in your question is kind of like the resource constraints of needing to do a lot of work in order to just kind of like with limited resources. One thought is we've managed to kind of supplement in interesting ways. So like being as creative about like how you get it done. I found it's actually kind of crazy. Like in government, I'd never had this experience before. But like you're not just like doing the thing. You're kind of like hacking all the ways that you might possibly do the things. So like, don't give up. If you like, one thought is like, just apply all the creativity that you would put into designing those services, and don't accept no, right? Like, just like keep trying to. Like, our answer to some of this was like, okay, can we partner with, with academic agency, academic institutions? Could we kind of get user researchers from these other areas? Could we that are interested in getting feedback, right? Could we bring in folks, obviously like talking to those folks and bringing them into the process. In terms of like actually streamlining or templates that are out there, I'm not aware of any like, we were doing a project similar, I think it was like early on in something relative to precision medicine, but basically like the collection and doing some natural language processing, some other things around like how to just like analyze, not just transcribing that qualitative data, but like starting to take really interesting semantic analysis as a way to like shortcut some of that stuff. I'll have to like talk to me after, and I'll look up exactly where that was. But I don't know if this is like this is helpful to answer your question. You wanna, yeah.
Just like a kind of general change-making practice that worked well for me. Back to the subject of trust also, is sometimes I would have an insight about a way I thought something should be different or could work better, more effectively, and the institution is like, no, for whatever political reason. But then I would figure out, okay, what's a problem you actually want to solve that I could use my same sort of methods to solve for you? And I would do that for them first, and then they'd be like, oh, wow. And then they would let me do it for the other thing. So it's just kind of understanding that there's kind of a method and a mindset to problem solving that can apply to any problem, and building the trust so they know you can solve problems safely, and then they'll let you do maybe something a little more risky.
And we'll do one more question if we can keep it to 30 seconds.
Hey, my name is Rohan. I was a recent Code for America fellow and did the Affordable Housing Data Hub. It allowed agencies to share, maintain, update data. I was curious about the concept of the learning agenda and the evaluation, and I was just kind of curious whether there's like a template or an example of agencies already doing that, and whether it's kind of be something that every level of government entertains.
Yeah, the model that the commission used to recommend the learning agenda was at the U.S. Department of Labor. They had the first chief evaluation officer who worked across the programs and agencies within the Department of Labor to come up with, if they could conduct evaluations over time, what questions would they want answered. And then she procured those evaluations. Those are online, but I'd be happy to provide those to the group if that would be useful. I don't see why another organization wouldn't find this a useful approach, because if you're investing research dollars, or even if you're just exploring available research, knowing what questions you want answered is a very good place to start.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, audience, for being here. Thank you to all of our partners, our partnering organizations. Thank you, Christian, for facilitating, and our panelists. I thought this was great. If you would like more information from any of our panelists, maybe they will stick around and chat with you. Please eat and drink. If you have questions about Austin Tech Alliance or the Data Coalition, please come up and talk to us. If you need to register to vote, please come and see me. And please sign up for the Austin Tech Alliance newsletter. There's information on the cards right outside those doors. Thank you for being here.
Water is life.
Oh, okay. And my network is legal, and your comment about the what most visited pages. That's the number one thing that people are looking for when it comes to but it's the number. It's still pretty representative. It's jobs and jobs. Always. No matter where you go. They're always going to you sit around a little bit, little trashy cats that moves around. But they're looking for jobs with the city.
collection of intelligence which is very defined. We're so afraid of bonding with other humans now. We rather find animals to bond with. So as we get lonelier, we search more dogs.
I mean, obviously it's not for everyone's fault, but if it releases oxytocin or something, I mean, like even looking at pictures, so it makes you happy.
Well, that's the issue of other humans too. When you have two joint families, you always have little kids when you're joint family. So kids are always there because the baby is good for you. Now that's lost. So I think that's why animals are just, that's a bigger way to get somebody wanting. It's a brain.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I think that animals are like me because
Yeah.
their energy and
Yes, exactly. Right, should be having no babies. One or two instead of 7 to 10.
It's a great entry point for regular people into open data where you can overcome the language of data and development and things like that. It's just that your spreadsheet, you don't need to be a data scientist to do this. What I'm pushing is, people just no cost ever to use what do you recommend? Yeah, so it kind of like looks at what you're doing and says, okay, it's this kind of data, and based on a million other times we've done this, this is kind of what they were looking for. So you can just kind of ask for one, which is really interesting and accessible.
So is this data that's related to your, Google interpreting your data, or just have
You just download the data set from the Austin Open Data portal and then just use it or you import it into Google Data Studio. So it's simple tools like from the city. There was
Oh, okay. And I wanted to
Yeah, David Yoakum's great, and the new assistant city manager. No, assistant city manager. Oh, okay. Christopher Short.
Oh, hi.
Howdy, happy. Hey, cool color.
what they want to do is then start, once you have those insights, start doing, I think it's health checks on how you're doing compared to everyone else in the market. So there's going to be a data analysis kind of a reporting